Let's go ahead and so we will go back to Mabel Poblet in just a moment, and let's go ahead and kind of get a bigger picture establishing shot. So I think this painting pretty straightforward. Time to buy Cuban art. What do you think about what is that kind of? Is this a is this meant to be ironic? Do you think there's a is there a joke here? Do you think is that meant to be serious? Like, or what is the joke here? Why is this woman kind of suggestively raising her skirt? How does that relate to time to buy Cuban art? Maybe we'll just leave that open for a moment. So this, I think, relates to the prostitution that was so commonplace in Cuba before the revolution. I think even today, unfortunately, sex tourism is very common around the world. And I think someone says, yeah, ironic. Yeah, exactly. I think there's a kind of self-awareness about the art world. I'm commenting on what Dacia chatted, that there's a kind of, and you hear this word a lot in Cuba when you go there. The word is puteria, which is like puta, which is whore, like very derogatory slang word, not really something you wouldn't use whore in thinking common language, but it refers to whoredom, like prostitution, and it's not just like prostitution literally. It's just the idea of selling yourself off, selling your soul off for whatever short-term gain, personal gain, and I think it comes at many costs, personal costs, so societal costs, and I think the artist here is making light of the fact that the artists kind of are, prostituting themselves to the art world, offering their, sexual, whatever you call it, favors in exchange for money is, I guess, metaphorically the same as offering your talent or your creativity in exchange for money, right? And so, I think that's something. It doesn't not just the art world in any part of life. If you sacrifice your soul for money, you become sort of metaphorically a prostitute. You're selling off, and you could say, selling off your labor, your creativity. So I think that is a very important, ironic self-awareness that this artist is conveying about the art world, especially in terms of tourism and the way tourism inevitably alienates the local population from the hotels, the dance clubs, and eventually, of course, the art world. And cruise ships arriving to Cuba, um, with tourists getting off, looking around, having a very superficial, almost Robert Rauschenberg superficial experience with Cuba, and then get back on the cruise ship and go. And that's true in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, where usually that money from tourism and the cruise ship doesn't really filter into the local population, especially because the cruise ships want to keep all that money on the cruise ship. And I think that's a good metaphor for just how tourism kind of warps. If you start selling to tourists, then you're no longer selling to locals. And this becomes really extreme in places like Venice, Italy, in any UNESCO preserved places around the world where you're preserving buildings and preserving culture just for tourists and not necessarily for locals. And in a place like Venice, you don't even have Venetians live in Venice anymore. They all live on the mainland because they're Airbnb-ing all their homes. And I think Airbnb is another great example, right? If when Airbnb becomes a thing, then everyone starts buying homes just to rent them out for Airbnb, and then you no longer have people living in homes, and it's very similar to what happens with the art world being, being at the service for foreigners, and not necessarily being a mirror image to what's going on for Cubans, and you're no longer selling to Cubans, and so your art isn't about Cuba so much as what can I make that appeals to the foreigners. And I think any artist will hopefully reach a point where they realize, okay, hold on, that's a short term, that's a good short term way to get money, but long term you're going to ultimately eviscerate your soul. You're going to hollow out that thing that makes everyone want to buy art in Cuba in the first place, which is, what are you you're offering something of substance to the art world that's so hungry for substance, because otherwise the art world is just kind of gobbling up narcissistic vanity, stuff that's vain and or just collectible. Or I think of Damien Hirst being a great example. He's an artist who cut up all the cows and put them in formaldehyde, or suspended the shark in formaldehyde, and then started making skulls with diamonds on the outside. And there is maybe a saving grace to it. It's very ironic and or all about materialism run amok. But there's also kind of a sense that Damien Hirst represents that the worst, where the art world is just so desperate for new subject matter. He offers up a shark that I think he hunted down. He had an Australian, fisherman get a shark and put it in formaldehyde. And for me, that's just so, don't get me wrong, I would never say that you should censor it or not allow it, but there's something so unethical about like taking an animal and putting it in formaldehyde. Like the shark probably had shark family and shark babies. And so, and just to do so for the novelty of suspending the shark in formaldehyde seems like a great example of just the art world reaching a kind of, literally jumping the shark, as they say. Jumping the shark means kind of passing that point of no return where you've lost a kind of essential dignity. And I think dignity is so important for understanding Cuba, for good or for bad. The dignity of having your own country's sovereignty, the dignity of having a country that doesn't just serve the United States, it doesn't just export raw materials to other places. And so dignity is, I think, so important as a kind of measurement of a country's, sense of self, sense of service to the people, in the country. And I think, this painting captured the indignity of the art world when it's sort of the equivalent of selling yourself off for money, right? And so these other points here are bulleted on the left. Don't burn your boats. Remember, don't, if you leave Cuba, you burn your boats, equivalent of burning your boats. The death of Fidel, we'll see, the Cuban millennials, and of course, next class, Cuban street art, and how that is a sort of counterbalance to what we're going to see today, which is art that comes from art students who are trained, in these art academies in Cuba, created either during the revolution or after. This is an example down below of one of the beautiful works of architecture just to the west of Havana, an art school. And this is definitely a place you should visit if you go to Cuba one day. And, this is what a cool art school and what a neat design to accommodate the rainfall and the blurring of exterior and interior, and a really wonderfully artistic building too. And so this is one of the art schools built during the revolution. And, if you go to Cuba, I don't know if the attendance is the same as it was before, but that's the kind of thing you have to wonder about. If you're a doctor studying at medical school, or if you're an artist studying at art school, you might decide, I want to go to the United States. But of course, that might mean you have to go back to school. The United States isn't going to recognize your medical degree in Cuba, but maybe as an artist, you might still be able to make art in the United States. And often Cuban artists go to Miami, but what you discover is your art isn't as valuable because the whole excitement about Cuban art really hinges on the fact that you are in Cuba making art that's about Cuba and or has a kind of unique Cuban twist, which a flavor, which certainly one part of that flavor is a kind of how does your art relate to this idea of like a communist or totalitarian society? Like for a while, art from China was really popular about a decade ago. It might still be, but I think that's really part of the excitement was the art world reaching a point of boredom and wanting the novelty of reaching into other markets that might rejuvenate the art world and or make collectors make more money because they've discovered a new kind of place where there's a rich treasure trove of art. And I think Cuba is certainly an example of that. And whether or not this continues, I think it's very likely this generation we're looking at today will be the last will be the peak of the revolutionary era, and then until there's some other political change, you'll see a sort of a decline in the number of artists who stay in Cuba and make art. And I think that's very sad if that turns out to be the case. I hope not. But I think that's why this generation of Cuban millennials will, in their next maybe decade, have to kind of prove whether or not they kind of want to stay in Cuba and why, and or if they leave Cuba once and for all. And if they do stay in Cuba, will their artwork kind of be be out of touch with the average Cuban, or will it hold up a mirror to Cuba? And of course, it's very hard to be critical as an artist in Cuba because you might get in trouble with the government, especially because, culture, if you're an artist and you start criticizing the government, not only are you risking your career, but you're also biting the hand that feeds you because the government paid for your schooling. And so you can understand how it's a very tricky, you're sort of walking on a tightrope if you're an artist. So you're not likely going to be too critical, but this might be as close as you get. And this is, I think, a great example of an artist playing around with those barriers, those boundaries. The word Fidel, of course, is Fidel Castro, but it also means loyalty, and it's shaped like a flag. So this is a good example of, you know, saying something that could be interpreted as controversial, but because you're just saying Fidel and you're doing so in blood, it can be interpreted either negatively or positively. So, I think why Cuban art might be so interesting to a lot of people is because these artists have found a sort of way to encode their criticism behind the prevailing conventions like loyalty, Fidel, yeah, loyalty and country and nationalism. So I think today we'll see a lot of examples of uh, veiled criticism or criticism through means that aren't direct, indirect criticism of the government and or holding up a mirror to society in a way that doesn't necessarily make the government aware of that will somehow say below the radar, so to speak, right? So this is the kind of this is the prevailing winds. This is what you typically expect in Cuba. This kind of sloganing, country, land, fatherland, or death. So, that's the kind of attitude in Cuba. This is very much from a page torn from the um, within the revolution, everything against it, outside of it, nothing, either or. There's no like, gray area. And this is exactly the kind of polarized view of politics that make it so tricky to for artists, because you have to either be very propagandistic or be super kind of metaphorical, but you can't be super abstract, right? We saw that abstract art doesn't really have a place in Cuba too either. So it's almost like you have to triangulate how your art fits in between the politics, the importance of communalism, and of course, also being true to your and not becoming a prostitute, right? Not prostituting yourself, martyring yourself on your own vanity or your own kind of for your own self interest, and of course, not biting the hand that feeds you. And so you see all over Cuba still, a lot of these, icons of the iconography of revolution. But I think it's very different when you take it to the street and paint Che Guevara versus the government, officially sanctioning muralism like you see here. And of course, people it feels almost like the people alive are somewhat like either not only just so far removed from time from these people. This young girl here who grew up, you know, and in a time when Che Guevara is long gone, and might as well be George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, right? Jose Marti certainly is almost like an Abraham Lincoln, and the kids maybe don't feel that sense of connection to that time of the 1950s, and perhaps grew up with a lot of propaganda, but certainly don't have a direct connection to Batista and the world before the revolution. And so it's very hard to transmit the same values because every generation grows up, in a new context. And these murals and these public works of art are meant to kind of remind people of the past and celebrate the past and maybe, deepen make the institutionalization of the revolution. But, that becomes almost like uh, like something um, out of touch, almost to the point of like obliviousness, because if you reach a point where you can't provide for your basic needs, these pictures seem kind of almost like a parody of reality. Just having these smiling faces in a time when you can't afford your next or can't find your next meal. There's no fuel for for transportation. So I think putting a happy face on a horrible situation can be good. And so we'll see, especially next week, some of the street artists start painting pictures of children, happy children, as a way of kind of almost like giving kids a sense of hope in a time of despair. And of course, Hugo Chavez and Nelson Mandela are two international supporters of Fidel Castro, who will look at today briefly. Hugo Chavez was the socialist Bolivar, and the legacy of Bolivar, a kind of a sense of unifying and or liberating Latin America from tyranny, oppression, colonization. So Hugo Chavez is kind of like perhaps a new Fidel Castro for Venezuela. Venezuela is super rich with oil, and that's why Venezuela has such a kind of powerful position in Latin America because of its oil richness, and it exchanged this oil for Cuban doctors. And because of that, Fidel, I think, got a little bit of another lease on life. I think he was able to extend his grip on power in Cuba another decade or so, because they benefited from all the oil from Venezuela. But the problem is all they're doing is kicking the can down the road because Cuba doesn't have the ability to produce power, apart from petroleum. Using oil is a very inefficient way of producing power at a large scale. So there's no solar farms in Cuba. There's no nuclear power plant. There's no wind farms. There's just generators that need oil, and there's no oil. And so, in a way, you could say Hugo Chavez gave Fidel another, fix, another bit of drugs to keep the addiction going. But now Cuba is kind of in rehab and doesn't have any of the drugs that it's addicted to. And so oil definitely makes the world go around still. And if you don't have it, it's very hard to provide for basic needs, pay to fuel your tractors, to create fertilizers, and all kinds of other things, to get to work. So, this is definitely a time when artists are reflecting on this last era and wondering, I think, about what comes next. I think Che Guevara's body being returned to Cuba is a big part of this reckoning with history and these icons from the revolution, who are the equivalent of, like I said, or the equivalent of Lincoln, Washington, the sort of founding fathers of the revolution. And maybe even a time where maybe Cuba shifting from that masculine focus to perhaps opening up, maybe the pendulum swinging to more of a feminine, or just getting away from that masculine disciplinarian military kind of uh, you know vision of leadership towards something else. And of course, 9/11, you can't overstate the importance of 9/11 on this, at least on the world, and certainly my generation. I was in New York on 9/11, and boy, the smell after I was in Chinatown, and the smell was so horrible. It was like this asbestos that kind of oily, metallic smell. And it's just horrible. And it's really, like 5,000 people died, and the whole world changed because we went from kind of an age of innocence between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. There was this very kind of a sense of unity around the world. The Cold War is ending. This is when China, I think, joined the WTO, and it felt like the whole world was coming together in this kind of after the Cold War. And then 9/11 made the whole world become really militarized. The United States especially become more militarized, and more the surveillance state began with video cameras everywhere. And then the government started using the internet to really manipulate us. And I think that continues today with, whether it's the, Silicon Valley and, Washington, and using the internet to, control us, and to it's really kind of advance their propaganda. And so in a way, you could say the world and the United States became, I think, a lot more totalitarian in that kind of Big Brother 1984 way than ever. And it also shifted our focus away from Cuba towards fighting the war on terror, aka invading Afghanistan, and for no reason whatsoever, invading Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. And yet, it goes to show that there was this sort of imperialist ambitions in the Middle East, which I think today is that era is coming to an end, but not without a lot of collateral damage, obviously, in the Middle East. And who knows if there'll be more, if the war on terror will continue. I do think in a lot of ways Barack Obama was a way of shifting the pendulum back away from that estrangement between the West and the Middle East. And I think represented a real course correction to kind of reach out and create some sort of brotherhood, or sisterhood, or whatever hood between the United States and the Middle East, after kind of bombing the crap out of these countries. So, even today, I think there's still kind of a sense of bitterness between the two sides, and it goes back to 9/11, and probably goes back well beyond when the United States invaded a lot of countries during the Cold War, including Iran in 19 I think 53 under Eisenhower. So there's a lot of animosity around the world because of the Cold War, and then after 9/11, I think that continues. And like I said, Cuba is sort of left alone because it's no longer a swing state for presidential elections, and it's no longer a place where the Soviet Union is putting missiles, or even I think the world has shifted away from communism to the point where we don't feel a paranoia about Cuba. And this is a time when the United States commits all kinds of atrocities, including this kind of to see United States soldiers torturing people who were captured during the war on terror is really horrible thing to see, especially when you think of these a lot of this stuff probably took place in Guantanamo, where we have a prison as part of our naval base in Cuba. So this kind of picture, as hard as it is to look at, is really important for showing the evil side of war and terrorism, and how both sides, the United States included, really it warped its own sense of right or wrong in the name of fighting terrorism. I mean, this is once you do stuff like this, you are the terrorist. So that's what's going on in the backdrop as Cuba kind of has to find its way forward in the 21st century. And this kind of thing only fuels the Cuban government's ability to use politics to preserve power, because they'll say, look at what the United States is doing. They're not good. And that reinforces the power of the Cuban government or the military, because they can point to the United States and say, look at them, look at what they're doing. And there's a lot of truth to that. United States, ever since the Cold War and John F. Kennedy, has been in this kind of tricky situation where we want to control the world, but we want to control the world without the world without while claiming to be the sort of honest broker. We are the most credible people to control the world. But of course, to control the world, I think by definition means you're not necessarily credible, because you should want to share power. And the world is, I think, a round table where everyone has a seat. But I think you have to look at that in terms of the end of the Cold War, United States being the only sort of superpower after World War II, including the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the Soviet Union's gone after the end of the Cold War, and shrank to the Russia. And of course, Russia is trying to grow back into kind of being an empire now. But I think you guys understand that context pretty well. So as far as Cuba goes, remember, tourism became the solution to the special period in the 1990s, a way to bring income to Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in addition to your typical tourism, which means going to the beach, going to hotels, there's also cultural tourism, right? Maybe even sports tourism. Of course, there's sexual tourism too. That's, I don't think, not something you want to aspire to. But even things like cultural tourism have a unexpected drawback, like that the way it might you might uh, sell your culture for foreign consumption, right? And just imagine in New York, if you go to New York City, you go into galleries, and the galleries are all just for foreigners and not necessarily for, for the US audience. Or go to Mexico City, and all the art is just for gringos, right? And not for Mexicans. That would feel very weird. And I'm sure you guys have all been to those kind of rinky-dink tourist markets where the art is just, maybe a picture of a beach, or picture of a local woman holding fruit. And that's kind of the lowest grade quality of tourist art. But then you can reach all the way to, like, okay, here's tourist art that's a little more like Andy Warhol. You always see those shops in places like Southampton, or Soho, where it's like, it's not totally tourist art, but it's not totally tourist art. It's not high art. It's the sort of Andy Warhol fashion glamour, and it still feels very much paint by numbers. And you guys can easily spot that kind of art too. And but then further along, you do have higher end art, which does start to kind of that it does have a kind of high art, high culture kind of value. But usually you won't see that at like a tourist trap, or you probably would see that in a gallery. So you need like a gallery system as a place to a stage to display higher end art. But of course, the gallery system in Cuba is run by the government, so you can see that also means that you still don't have this autonomous art world that's totally free from government kind of either scrutiny or support. And so again, that's that tightrope that Cuban artists have to walk between, not biting the hand that feeds you, being true to yourself, having a sense of purpose and, direction with your art, and also not, pandering to the tourist audience. It's really, tricky, balancing act. In the United States, maybe the equivalent would be, wanting to reach a lot of people, but doing so in a way that doesn't dumb down your art, so it just reaches the lowest common denominator, right? It's a very tricky balance, being selling your art, but also not selling yourself off, right? So, this art, I think, from this period is, I think, that earlier example we saw, a good time to buy Cuban art. These artists are kind of aware of this dilemma they're facing. I think this is not necessarily the best example of it, but I think the self-awareness of the art world, holding this Cubana Airlines, travel is still kind of almost under the surface here. This idea of travel, bringing art collectors to Cuba, and then their art leaving Cuba. Your art leaves Cuba, but you don't necessarily leave Cuba. And here with Pedro Alvarez Castillo, he's addressing some of these things we saw earlier in the semester, and it's a very clever way revisiting or maybe even tackling contemporary issues by hiding behind the shield of art that came from the past. So you probably recognize this from, I hope you do. And you guys remember seeing this lady, I think it was called En la Ausencia, in the absence. We saw the woman sweeping. Of course, what's changed here? So tell me if you remember where we saw this, initially early in the semester, a woman sweeping in the time of slavery. I think this is right around 1886. So what is the artist doing here? Why, revisit this woman here who we've seen, and what has he done with the background? I hope you guys all know the Cinderella story. I'm sure you guys do. I think there's a movie about Snow White now. There's kind of an age of, updating our understanding of these stories, these fairy tales. So I think you start with a fairy tale is a sort of story that we tell children about, life and choices we make and love. And so there's like the background of a fairy tale juxtaposing the Cinderella fairy tale. Now, Cinderella, correct me if I'm wrong, she's a low status girl. Cinderella, I think literally from Italian, cinder is the ashes or the embers of a fire. So the girl who's in charge of just stoking the cinders or selling cinders is by definition, a low status person. And Cinderella is a story about a girl who goes from low status to high status, right? And so perhaps here they're playing off the idea of the fairy tale of going from being low status, slave, to the Cinderella idea. And you can maybe relate that to the art world. Of course, importantly, you have to think about her looking into the mirror. You can still see the mirror here on the right. And so, you have to think about, is she looking in the mirror now? When she looks in the mirror at herself, is she, now like imagining herself be going to the United States? I think that's a similar kind of idea, but now, of course, updated for the present era. And so you have to see this as a strategy to address the contemporary situation behind the shield of already, created imagery. And I think that's a wonderful strategy for holding up a mirror to the present day without getting yourself into too much trouble, perhaps. So I think this artist has a few other examples here. Here's a version we saw earlier. And it might be a great artist to write about for your paper because, of course, notice the table there is missing a leg. Yeah, I think that's significant because it's, even she has like three legs. She's leaning on a broom, which you could say symbolically leaning at slavery, kids kind of holding her up. And so I think there's many subtle layers here. Even the roof almost looked like the flag, perhaps, or just some kind of weird distortions. And of course, looking in the mirror, I think is really fundamental. And the fact that the mirror is so close to us and feels so large, I think is also has some symbolism there. But I think this is a wonderful example of artists playing with imagery that came from the past, from the colonial era, and updating it for the present day. And of course, updating it through this Disney filter. And, what does Disney represent? Disney represents like, nostalgia. It represents paradise. Florida is a paradise and Disney is the paradise of paradise. Everyone in the United States wants to go to Disneyland. I think. I'm sure there's exceptions. I mean, I don't want to go to Disneyland. I hated Disneyland. But you could see they're using Disneyland as kind of a backdrop. And I think that idea of like the commercialization, perhaps, but the spectacle. Disney is like this way of using spectacle to make money. And so I think that's kind of the overlap. The art world is like, and the idea of the art world is, kind of like Disneyland, like you come to Cuba, you see the spectacle of art. The Chevy, the car here is a symbol of I think it's Cuba being having this unique American US influence on it and kind of being stuck in a time warp perhaps, but also this sort of people want to go to Cuba to experience the spectacle of like, oh, a Chevy that is still around that we don't see anymore. And it's almost just like novelty for novelty's sake. And I think that's what the artist is trying to getting at here by combining the slave holder there on the right, or I guess that would be like a guajiro with his dog going out in the countryside, saying goodbye to the slaves, or saying acknowledging, or I don't know, waving goodbye on his way out into the countryside. And so, I think they're making a parallel between that and maybe the present day where, Cuban, who's living in this mansion? Is it Fidel? Is it the artists? Is it tourists? In a way, I think it's almost like tourists are living in that mansion and you're excluded or isolated from everyone else. But certainly, I think room for a lot more interpretation there. And I think likewise here, it's playing with all these Landalus paintings, and combining them with Disney or pop culture or imagery from the United States, and to very fruitful results. There's literally Mickey Mouse kind of greeting in the window. So the kind of Mickey, and this was common in the early 21st century. Radiohead, the band Radiohead, this one that sings "I'm a creep, I'm a loser." That they had like an evil Disney, evil Mickey Mouse. So and I think Mickey Mouse recently entered the public domain, meaning you can use Mickey Mouse's image without Disney suing the pants off of you. So, in a way, Mickey Mouse is a symbol of the United States as much as maybe the Statue of Liberty, and also a symbol of Florida, but also a symbol of kind of tourism or spectacle, and maybe even, cartoon, of that kind of cartoon world that kids live in, but isn't necessarily the world that adults live in. And so from that, maybe we have to remember the importance of performance, which doesn't completely die out in Cuba, but I think, of course, is can be very tricky in a time of crisis. And I think still in Cuba you have a somewhat of a vibrant performance scene early in the early 21st century. But I think the real tricky thing with performance is, of course, with tourism. If tourism is the real focus economically, and artists are telling to tourists, performance, I think, is really important because it will almost by definition speak to the local Cuban. So I think it's always going to be a lot more, um, you know, in touch with the average Cuban than art that's sold to tourists. But I think, those two go different directions. Art, the object, can be put in a gallery, and performance is almost by definition a more communal and more about the world in which, people do the performance. And so I'd say probably performance artists are keeping, and I think we'll see that later today with Carlos Martial being a very important artist who is still addressing the kind of reality with Cuba. But for now, let's focus more on some, the object of art that we see here and here, of course. So I'm not going to spend too much time on each of these artists. I just wanted you to get a sense of some of the different range of artists. This is an artist who I know. He's an artist who has a PhD in art history and is a working artist. We've seen some of his work before, but interestingly, he worked and collaborated with Rauschenberg in the 90s and made a T-shirt. And I don't know, one day someone needs to go looking in thrift stores in Cuba, see if they can find the Robert Rauschenberg T-shirt, because that will probably worth several, and just imagine in Cuba, there's someone who has a Robert Rauschenberg shirt, and it's probably would be worth like, if not a few $1,000s, probably, I wouldn't be surprised, worth several tens of thousands of dollars. And he collaborated with Rauschenberg then to make some work. But I think this idea of vomiting is a very clever way of addressing this the personal, like the expression. To vomit out is also, is, you could say, a metaphor for art, but also a metaphor for like sickness. and a way of externalizing your inner world, right? So it's a very powerful and metaphorical strategy for, talking about that sort of daily dilemma of where is it okay to express yourself and how do you express yourself without getting in trouble? Well, vomiting is a really wonderful way of, well, everyone gets sick, and it's, again, a great strategy for addressing something that everyone's feeling, like a kind of maybe sense of uneasiness or sickness, and vomiting out is a way of purging that sickness. And I think it's a great metaphor for like politically purging that inner world that maybe is hard to express in a society where everyone's watching you. For instance, to be homosexual in Cuba in the 1980s, probably well into the 1980s, meant you had to be in the closet. And if not be in the closet, you had to be very careful. And so you can see that as like you're hiding your inner self behind this veneer, this revolutionary veneer. And so vomiting is a wonderful like release, escape that is a kind of analogy to the idea of containing whatever on the inside, imagine you're in a car and you don't want to vomit because you might spoil the car, right? So you wait until there's a safe place for you to finally get that purge, right? So it's much more than just vomiting. It's like something everyone's feeling but is not willing to say. And your heart, even just a picture of a heart. And this is why I think Cuban art is so powerful, because a picture of a heart in the United States is kind of like, okay, it's a picture of a heart. But in Cuba, it might mean like your country, your sense of sacrifice. Like what, like this is can the government reach your heart, right? Is this within the revolution or is it outside the revolution? Are your body parts your domain? Are they the government's domain? And I think, to throw yourself into the Straits of Florida seeking freedom means you're taking control of your own physical autonomy, and be going outside the revolution. But of course, that means danger, putting yourself into danger as well. So here's a quote from Tonell, and it's a very, I think, important quote. Many artists, Cuban artists, face commercial demands based on distorted perceptions of what Cuba is and what Cuban art should be. This kind of goes back to those Disneyland pictures we just saw. In fact, the market is aimed at tourists from well-informed, wealthy consumers to creators of major museums to European visitors who buy T-shirts of Che Guevara and sip their mojitos as they remember May 1968. Now, I think May 1968 is a reference to that mural we saw, the spiraling mural, which was the Salon de Mayo reference, which was a show of unity in support of the revolution. And I think what Tonell is basically saying is that this is exactly what we've been talking about. The whole market is not aimed at Cubans so much as attracting these foreign visitors. And just the fact that he's aware of this and saying this means I think a lot of the artists from this era understand that there's a kind of trade-off, that to attract all these tourists means you're also kind of selling off your country to these foreigners, which, again, goes back to the kind of era before the revolution when Cuba has no sovereignty and really is selling off sugar to the United States, and a gambler's paradise, a place with prostitution run amok. Remember, Wilfredo Lamb was very critical of Cuba when he went back in the 1940s, 1950s. So I think likewise, Tonell is pointing out basically that the art world is somewhat, a realm of prostitution where you're selling off art to people who really just want this kind of uh, Disneyland view of Cuba, with Che Guevara being the equivalent of Mickey Mouse and Goofy, right? And everyone, I hope you know, the mojito is a classic Cuban drink with rum. Uh, what is it? I guess it doesn't have to be Coke. Rum. I think it's actually a Sprite and mint leaves. Correct me if I'm wrong, but basically a very traditional Cuban drink. So that's the idea, that kind of a tourism and art combined into this very kind of. It's sort of like someone who comes to the United States and just wants to go to McDonald's and Disneyland and I don't know, wherever else, the Statue of Liberty, and that's and most people in the United States don't, in New York, don't even go to the Statue of Liberty. um, and it says, okay, so now Los Carpinteros, the carpenters, this is an example of kind of artists collaborating together, And I think you've probably seen some of their art. They've traveled around the world. And this is a first example, although I think Tonal is another example of artists who are now traveling around, benefiting from this age of the biennials. Venice biennials, Havana has its own biennials. And this is kind of part of the globalization of the art world, which really begins after the Cold War, where those two worlds of East and West kind of combine. And now you have, I think, a globalized art world ever since the 1990s, which I think is partly what fuels interest in Chinese art and art from Cuba, and why Rauschenberg wanted to travel around the world in the 90s, because that end of the Cold War means, well, now we can bring artists together from around the world. I think we continue to experience this kind of globalization of the art world, and how the Carpinteros relate to that is a very interesting question. I think also how all the artists we're looking at to do at today relate to this kind of bridging of East and West and the globalization of the art world. I think these artists are kind of, in a way, more reacting to the art world beyond Cuba than necessarily holding up a mirror to reality within Cuba. But of course, there might be exceptions, and or there might be more of a veiled critique depending on how you interpret their artwork. I think it's just a wonderful example of surrealist kind of sculpture with all the benefits of Cuban education, with a real emphasis on craft and skill, and just quality, that you might see, and depending on where you are in the United States. Like typically when like at least 20 years ago, if you go to your typical art school or your typical, art studio in any university in the United States, you'd usually see a bunch of abstract expressionist paintings that are really huge and ambitious and big and bold. But not a lot of necessary artists who are really like dedicated to craft. And I think that's shifting today. And I think in a way, digital art has become the sort of new horizon for art. But if you're a Cuban artist in the early 21st century, you're not using digital art. And if anything, you're still working from that more traditional world of art, drawing, painting, silkscreen, but you don't have access to silkscreen. So maybe shifting to other materials is a way of being resourceful in a time of scarcity. And I think that's probably what's going on, and what has been going on. And since the last class, we saw a lot of artists, exploring different materials. Of course, they were more reacting to the crisis, the Balsero crisis in the 1990s, with people leaving Cuba. Here, I think the Carpinteros are really more aware of the art world, and are trying to keep up with that art world beyond Cuba. So this is, I think, a good example of artists who reach this level where they can travel back and forth and are really more in dialogue with an art world beyond Cuba, in a way that Cubans really haven't experienced up until the end of the Cold War, because now there isn't that kind of political polarization in the world. So I don't know if there's anything metaphorically meaningful here. I don't think this is commenting. I don't think this is a critique of Fidel Castro or of Cuba. I mean, there could be, right? I mean, I think you could interpret that. But, I think it's more like surrealist art that I think you could say is wonderful because it doesn't have any obligation to the revolution. So you could say this is kind of outside the revolution because they're just operating according to their own artistic interests, and that is wonderful. I think it would be horrible if all artists felt an obligation to politics, because politics has a way of not just dumbing down art, but it feels very short-lived. Anything that's propagandistic feels like it has a lifespan, and gets very stale and boring once there's a new administration or there's a new political winds shift. That's not always the case, but to have something that's deeper, something that goes deeper than the present day or the temporary conditions, means your art might, have a longer lifespan and be more relevant to not just your generation, but the next generation and the generation beyond that. And, I think there's many exceptions to that, but I think in this case, there's a certain kind of timeless appeal to an artist making stuff that's just for their own, artistic ambition, serves their own ambitions, and doesn't necessarily serve the politics of the age. But then, of course, the question of, does it serve the society from which it's born? Does this serve the average Cuban? Or is this speaking to something essential Cuban? And do you need to hold Cubans to that standard? Do you need to hold Cuban artists to that standard? Do you hold U.S. artists to that standard? If you're in China, do you measure a Chinese artist's quality in terms of how they're addressing the circumstances of the average Chinese person? It can be very tricky when you make artists, have to give them obligations, right? And so, you might see a connection between this and, perhaps, we saw Elso before. I mean, a raised hand, there's some Islamic significance to that. I don't think there's any reference to the five pillars of Islam here, but maybe the universal, a hand being a universal symbol, maybe hands on the wall of a cave painting. But to put drawers in a hand is really wonderfully kind of poetic and almost like Duchampian, kind of juxtaposing two unexpected things. And the idea of a hand being a container is really, wonderful. And I don't necessarily need it to be anything more than that for me to really delight in it. And I think especially because it's so well made, that's what makes it so wonderful. That someone committed fully and put all that skill into something that's so useless and yet so wonderfully, metaphorically, wonderfully, odd and not all anything you'd ever expect. And yeah, I think like, we can all relate to the hand, and we can all relate to drawers. Combining the two is just, wonderfully surreal. And I don't know if they put anything inside the hand, but I absolutely love the Carpentieros, their work. Here's some more examples of it. And I think you can appreciate there's a kind of, when we talk about left hemisphere, right hemisphere, I don't know which, I don't want to say one corresponds to being more objective or not, but this for me is like, there's almost like a sense of, this is more one hemisphere. This kind of starts swinging back the other way. There's a certain authority to architecture or to carpentry, right? And it veers away from that sort of personal expression, but benefits from all the authority and the kind of familiarity of architecture, blueprints. And here, I think perhaps this is a little more metaphorical. Another example of work by the Carpentieros. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And or you got to wonder if they can maybe, here's a great example of maybe there's no fuel, no propane in Cuba. So, it's a couch you'd never want to sit on because it's not comfortable. It might burn you alive. But if there's no fuel, there's not really nothing to worry about. And, you might also think, what do you do when you're sitting on a couch? Well, often you're watching TV. And so there could be some kind of reference to day-to-day life in Cuba where, to sit on the couch means you're sort of getting getting exposed to propaganda. So there are a lot of ways you could interpret this that are perhaps a mirror image to, daily concerns in Cuba. Here is a lighthouse that is on its side. This is actually not, I didn't turn the photograph. It's actually a lighthouse, fallen lighthouse. So, you could look into the symbolism of that. Here's some of the more recent work by the Carpentieros. And this is, I think, very accessible because it relates to this very important monument in Havana of Che Guevara. This is in the backdrop of where Fidel gives a lot of his speeches or gave a lot of his speeches. So here they're using this iconography, even the way this icon is created. And instead of showing Che or other luminaries from the revolution, now they're showing your kind of day-to-day Cubans, average Cubans, and not just average, like older Cubans who've probably lived long enough to see all the different changes during the revolution, only to reach this point where there's a real question mark hanging over everything, and to kind of give the average Cuban the sense of monumentality, the kind of give them an iconic presentation here, I think is a wonderful way of swinging the art world in Cuba back towards the average Cuban. And so yeah, I think the Carpentieros, there's much more than meets the eye when it comes to their work. They're being very clever in walking that tightrope. And again, that's really, a nail that's twisted is like a useless object, right? But it also starts to resemble a human being, right? Start to feel like individuals who are twisted and contorted. And so you could see a lot of metaphorical qualities to that. When I see this, I also see like, we saw Ana Mendieta and her husband, horrible husband. Yeah, now I'm forgetting his name. I think you remember what I'm talking about. Putting art on the floor, figuring out how to a way to bring art into the gallery. So I just think you have to kind of really look at this remember other artists we've seen that will help, I think, bring it to life and help make sense of the imagery or the choices the artists make. But I think there's a really powerful because, it does seem just like a bunch of enlarged nails, kind of like the way Claus Oldenburg would enlarge matchsticks and turn them into a monumental sculpture. Here they're blowing up, making nails really large, and they're useless nails and they're rusted nails. We saw rusted microphones, and you can make you could see how these might make more sense in a place like Cuba versus the United States, right? Rusted nails seem to signify a lot more in Cuba than they would in the United States, where Cuba you have a lot of rainfall, but also a rusted nail means you're sort of the society's crumbling, right? And to be rusted means you're not revitalizing, you're not painting things, you're not restoring things. It's kind of a symbol of decline and decay. But I like the way they look like worms or people contorted, and like a way of like visualizing Cuban people suffering or reeling without being too on the nose. Because if you're showing Cubans reeling and suffering, maybe you're being too directly critical of the government and the sort of the situation that the government is kind of responsible for, or at least you could argue is responsible for. So again, I think you see these examples of artists bridging these two hemispheres, a sort of expression, self-expression, but also authority and metaphor and code language, and likewise here the card, the name. Some countries like in Iran, when you're born, you get a little booklet, and everything in your life, who you marry, where you go to school, is in this booklet, and it's kind of a form of state control. And in the United States, probably the equivalent of this is they have some sort of digital profile of each of us, and they market to us and they predict our shopping habits based on this digital profile that either the government or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever each of the companies has. Every time we sign up for a free website, they're basically taking our they're stealing our interests. They're taking all of our information because they can capitalize on them. They literally, market to us based on what they know about us. Well, the equivalent of that in a more totalitarian state is maybe something like this, some kind of card that has all the information about you. But using that as a sort of springboard for artistic expression is very clever and very powerful and, wonderfully tactful. And, here obviously artists are aware of the rise of the internet, Game Boys, television technology, but to create technology using cigar boxes or kind of more, wood is a really fun way of, expressing all kinds of different things that you might consider if you write about this artist. I think you can appreciate the range of output here. It's not like all artists are trying to be abstract expressionists or working with photography. There's a whole range. And yet, in spite of that range, there's a common denominator, which is exceptional skill and craft and originality, and in a way that I don't think you really even see in the United States, because maybe we're such a anything goes country. There's no real common culture, and yet the art world for me feels like in the United States it's so much more commercial and so much about um, even vanity, and I'm not saying of all, but I'm just like I think Cuban art is so much more, has a commitment to kind of either this a real deep sense of commitment to material and quality and craft and being resourceful. Um, and I think those can be, I think they say uh, necessity is the mother of creation, like the mother of invention. So in some ways, I think the lack of materials in the 90s has forced artists to be very clever about how to make art that just making art, period, um, using unconventional materials. And now we get to that kind of this age of these millennials here who are, I think, reacting to all the stuff we've been talking about. Um, I think William Perez is very interesting. He's someone I've met in Cuba, and I really love his work, especially his sculpture. But I don't think it's hard to really speak to the quality of his work with just a few examples we have here. But he's clearly addressing much more than just, I think, a real interest in, the state of Cuba. He's reflecting on the return of the body of Che Guevara. This is not William Perez, but here I think he's kind of making a parallel to that. Jose Marti's body brought back to Cuba, and a similar reflection on the future of the revolution. Even this, battleship or aircraft carrier kind of implies naval, the blockade, perhaps an embargo, but also maybe leaving Cuba on a boat. We saw that last class. So there's kind of layers of meaning here that are either, you could say contradictory or, updating the idea of travel based on this sort of new millennium of sensibilities. And so I think all the artists we see today are kind of responding to, on one hand, the 1990s, the Balsero crisis. They clearly decided to stay in Cuba. And because they've committed to staying in Cuba, they've kind of committed to artwork. And I think part of that commitment is because they are aware that there's a potential to have some kind of longevity or sustainable life in Cuba by selling to the art world. And artists like Rocio Garcia do come to the United States. I met her in New York during, I think it was out around 2009. And, to be able to come to the United States and show your artwork and go back to Cuba means you can really have a kind of career as an artist. And so I think that's why you see this real kind of revitalized commitment to art that's not necessarily about leaving Cuba or necessarily traveling across the Straits of Florida because of tourism coming into Cuba and that offering a new lifespan for artists. But that's not to say, of course, this sort of anxiety about travel and crossing the Straits of Florida doesn't continue to be the case. And I think will come back to rear its head in the last decade after the pandemic, especially where a lot of people are fleeing Cuba. But now it seems, and I'm still learning about this, it seems like many Cuban artists now who are leaving Cuba don't have to build makeshift boats so much as I think they either get enough money from remittances from abroad or somehow figure out a way to get enough money where I think they can get a visa from the government. And I'm sure there's all kinds of corruption, if not really shady stuff involved with this. But it seems, and I say this with a big asterisk, I'm not totally sure, it seems like there's is more ways than ever for Cubans to leave Cuba. And I think it's because, and not by boat, not by crossing the Straits of Florida, because the government knows that, even though they're leaving even though these Cubans are leaving, they're going to send money back to Cuba. So it seems like the government is allowing for more safe possibilities for travel, but I think it comes at a kind of tax. They tax you that you have to pay your way to leave Cuba. And, that's also pretty bad, obviously, but of course it means you might not necessarily perish in the Straits of Florida. So I'll show you a few more examples of her work. For me, when I see these are like, you think about, again, within the revolution, outside the revolution, these all feel very much like these are like the curtain is opening to reveal something hiding behind the curtain, and the curtain has stars on it, right? That feels like a very veiled reference to, the stars, the flag. If you reveal what's behind, here's this person with their own personal world. It could be like, they're into S&M, they're into fetish, they're into like, they have this different sexual orientations or stuff that, should be outside the revolution. And so, or could be, conceivably thought of as stuff that should be outside the revolution, right? So maybe, sitting in a bath is, in a bathroom, just like you would talk about vomiting or defecation, things that we do in private, or things that happen at night. Nightlife is often, outside the revolution. Things that happen at night are kind of like it's like Batman. Like Batman goes out and fights crime at night, right? During the day, he's Bruce Wayne. So there's a kind of sense of two identities. There's your revolutionary identity, then there's your sort of personal identity, right? So on here we have these like two police officers, and you see this all over Havana, like policemen standing on the street corner, representatives of the revolution, keeping things orderly while kind of people get drunk and party and have and experience nightlife. Often these police officers are recruited from the countryside because they're kind of they want to get out of their boring life in the countryside, but as a result, often the police are from a whole different kind of culture, if you will, than the people who are living in the city. And so you can imagine how that might create tension, if not kind of a sense that the officers who are policing you aren't necessarily from the world that you inhabit, right? So I think her work really speaks to this idea of being outside the revolution. And let's take a short break and we'll pick up where we left off. And I think just remember, as we look at more artists today, just remember that any of these artists are certainly worthy of consideration for your final paper. And you might be able to email or contact these artists and ask them about their work. And if you're having trouble writing about their art, you can use your interview as a real, heart and soul, the real meat of your paper, because I think the interview will be a wonderful kind of thing that you can just write about. Not, you don't have to, but I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to write about living artists who are really hungry for your interest. With artists like the Brito sisters, they don't really need much help because they're very famous and very successful. But certainly a lot of the younger artists, especially the ones who aren't super successful, will benefit from having any academic interest in their work and can use it as a way to kind of advance their own career. So that's something certainly to consider. So let's take a short break and we'll pick up in about 5 minutes and carry on. And I think you can see from this picture here of the two Chevys. Remember, this car is a symbol for Cuba because after the revolution, Cuba could no longer import cars from the United States, meaning the relationship with the United States is severed. And so these cars become almost a symbol both of that relationship that Cuba had with the United States, that close relationship, which has been over since the revolution, and a kind of symbol of Cuba's uniqueness having these cars that are still running around because Cuba can't really afford to produce its own cars and or import cars from far away. There are of course many cars in the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, but you notably see these Chevys floating around Cuba, driving around Cuba, because Cubans keep repairing them, and they become a symbol for both sort of Cuba's unique relationship to the United States, and just having this kind of oddly kind of obsolete cars driving around the city, something you really don't see anywhere else in the world. With, of course, exceptions when someone collects, these collector classic cars, but it becomes a symbol for Cuba. So this car is, I think a wonderful stand-in for Cuba, and also being used here as I think a way of addressing this important theme that we're talking about today. Both, of course, leaving Cuba, but leaving and coming back, right? The car is not just going one way, it's also coming back. And again, I think that speaks to a shift in the sensibility, understanding that Cubans have in relationship to the water and going abroad, which is in terms of art, you can leave Cuba as a one-way trip, or you can leave and come back. And I think, again, that's the real big shift that takes place in this generation, this awareness that tourism and selling artwork to not just tourists, but the art world means you might benefit from being able to travel. And so, can you blame a Cuban artist for wanting to stay in Cuba and keep making art and traveling back and forth? I don't think any of us can. I think that would be holding any artist to too high of a standard. And yet we have to, I think, be aware that there's a trade-off when any decision one makes. So I think we'll think about that as we move forward, but just kind of showing you more examples. Pandora's box is a very powerful metaphor. The Pandora is a woman in Greek mythology who, if I recall, kept all the vices in the world in a box. And the deal was, I think, whoever she married or a partner, the deal was just don't look in the box and everything will be great. And of course, the person looks in the box and then all the vices of the world are released. And, I think that's a pretty classic story and about human curiosity. It goes back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. But here, of course, deploying this for a Cuban situation is very, loaded. And of course, I think the idea here is, again, within the revolution, outside the revolution, the Pandora's box would be that, so almost a metaphor for your own inner world that you're supposed to keep shut up. Whether it's your sexual orientation or your criticism of the government, or even your desire to leave Cuba, you have to keep that all contained, because if you let it out, you might expose yourself to other people who might turn you in. You can score points in places like Cuba by turning someone else in and brandishing or enhancing your own sort of credibility by policing other people. And that's true here too. Like, right, you can, if you call out someone for bad behavior, you might gain some notoriety, become famous for, and that could be good or bad depending on the bad behavior you're calling out. But of course, in a world where in Cuba, it's a very different environment. And I think, there's United States, we tend to have a kind of anything go. You can be critical of the government. You're not going to get as much criticism for having an alternative lifestyle. But even so, even here, you have sort of a sense of repressed memories, repressed everywhere in the world. People kind of have understand this idea of keeping your own inner world private and not, exposing yourself to other people, other scrutiny from outside. Um, and now we get to Mabel Poblet, the artist we started with, and here you can say she's playing with origami, which is something I haven't seen before. I think origami is a Japanese paper, kind of a, I don't know what you want to call it, like an artistic form of expression. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it originates in Japan. And a lot of interesting uses of origami in outer space, and folding up paper, folding things up as a way to, minimize your footprint and expanding when you get to outer space. So I think she's using origami in a way that's very novel and wonderful, but also maybe something that shows her international focus or the scope of her international interests, and also a material that's very hard to come by in Cuba. Paper is not something that is just sort of an afterthought that we have here in the United States. We'll get back to that in a moment, but you notice her, and I'm going to point out a lot of these different artists, their pedigree. When you look at their artistic statements, almost all of them have some kind of footprint in the United States or in Europe or in China or somewhere abroad, and they're able to come to the United States and travel back to Cuba. And this is really, exceptional and unique compared to the artists we saw in the 90s or in the 80s, who all really were kind of confined to Cuba and never left Cuba. And if anything, benefited from someone like Ana Mendieta visiting Cuba or Rauschenberg visiting Cuba. Well, now these artists are able to travel. In fact, this work of art behind her here is in Tampa, Florida. And if I remember, this work is using flowers and stuff women make in an insane asylum, and making her artwork about that kind of world, revealing that world of women, in the insane asylum. And you can consider all the implications of that. I'd say she's someone who very much comes in the tradition of Antonia Bruguera and Ana Mendieta in terms of performance and bringing her body into the artwork, making her body almost a canvas for her artwork. And I think you see that here in her early career. We already looked at this painting, but you might consider how this relates to the origami shapes and how her artwork nicely ties back into her earlier work, which is to say, there's no severing between her early work and the present day. If anything, she's giving you kind of if you remember, Rauschenberg had his own approach to silkscreen and bringing together these sort of jigsaw pieces. Well, here, I think Mabel Poblet is doing a similar kind of jigsaw puzzle, not silkscreening, but something similar, but doing it with all the authenticity and that you would expect from a Cuban artist. And Rauschenberg is sort of a fish out of water, who I think is kind of playing with imagery that aren't really, he's not the fitting messenger, with though the message might be right. Similar to Wilfredo Lam and Picasso, this Rauschenberg is to Mabel Poblet as Pablo Picasso is to Wilfredo Lam. The right message, but maybe not the right messenger. Well, Mabel Poblet, I think, is the right messenger, and using her body, I think, is a very powerful way of kind of thinking about that. Is when you think about the personal as political, that's often a mantra in feminism, like, which is to say that your own personal politics are also, mainstream politics, or also can be considered political, right? Or your own personal choices, like kind of like saying you're going to the supermarket and buying something is a political choice, right? And that's very powerful. But of course, the other extreme of that is, then that means maybe everything you do is subject to scrutiny, political scrutiny. And I think, again, that really goes back to the body being a kind of a battlefield, right? I don't think here she's talking about abortion, but you might, of course, think about, the body being a battlefield in a more communist society where maybe you have to show more allegiance to the collective rather than perhaps your own choices or your own desires. And in this country, abortion is a big flashpoint for that idea. Is the personal political, likewise vaccinations, and to perform with your body using blood or blood-like substance has a kind of power in terms of performance, like we saw with Ana Mendieta, it makes you feel awkward seeing violence and using violence to kind of as a way of expressing yourself. And or maybe commenting on violence against women. These are very powerful ways of reclaiming a sense of autonomy in the face of maybe sexual oppression or patriarchal violence. But of course, in Cuba, there's many more layers or different layers of meaning to the same kind of act. So I think Ana Mendieta, like I said before, is a kind of mother figure, nourishing mother figure to the Cuban art world in terms of performance art and self-expression and even traveling freely. Ana Mendieta is almost like a blueprint for a template for what we're seeing today with an artist traveling freely from different countries, not necessarily having a sense of allegiance to one country or the other, but feeling like her journey relies on finding some kind of sense of balance between national identity, self-expression, and maybe the artist just feeling a sense of being untethered to a sense of homeland. Of course, she was exiled from her home. So likewise, I think Cubans feel a sense of, do you willingly put yourself into exile, or do you kind of travel back and forth and reap what other benefits that might sow for you, have sown for you. And I think Mabel Poblet is really, speaking to this, this generation of artists with some kind of homage to Ana Mendieta's legacy, using the body in her work. So here you can see those dots now that we saw on the map earlier are now becoming almost like footprints on this journey. As still some of the kind of authority of like architecture, but obviously shifting now, and you can see those little dots become almost like lunar phases or little electrons floating around that kind of become orderly or blossom into flowers. And that's, I think, exactly what her origami is. It's the kind of the next stage of transformation from these little dots, these nodes, into flowers that blossom. And yeah, that's neat. You don't see a lot of artists kind of either stay on one course throughout their career, very precise. Some kind of bounce around, like Rauschenberg. But Mabel Poblet kind of has a consistency in terms of these icons or these motifs that she has early on in her career that she doesn't leave behind, but allow transform into kind of these physical installations that you see here, or as in this case, origami. And I think there's a novelty to it, but I think there's always trade-off, right? I think the imagery gets a little lost. It almost becomes a very pixelated, low resolution image because of the origami. But I think if you look at the origami as a symbol of like those little pixels or the little spheres blossoming into a new kind of three-dimensional form, I could see this becoming really interesting, depending on where she goes next with it. Um, but I think at the other extreme, you could say, well, is origami something that really speaks to Cuban culture and the average Cuban? And I guarantee she's getting these art materials from abroad. It's not like these are made, the paper is probably not manufactured in Cuba. So probably when she goes abroad, she brings back a ton of materials with her. And that likewise, I think, does create some kind of disconnect perhaps from, the average Cuban who maybe doesn't necessarily have the kind of cultural awareness about origami and how it fits into what, I don't know, Japan or culture. But still, I think a really wonderful investigation, and maybe will be very fruitful depending on where she goes with it. It almost like a star shape that kind of you could say is a reference to, the flag or the revolution. But I think more likely, I'd say this is kind of another example of asserting your artwork as not necessarily being beholden to politics so much as your own inner world and your own desire to kind of be relevant in the international art world. And that might have been a third rail. That might have been a very radioactive thing to do several decades ago. But now that Cuba is committed to tourism and attracting tourist dollars, the government, I think, has a much different assessment of your worthiness as an artist and isn't going to throw you under the bus for asserting your art being within outside the revolution or beyond the revolution, because now anything that just attracts tourist dollars will just give the revolution more longevity. So things have shifted, And I think the artwork we're looking at today really speaks to that shift. Here is more, installation work, if you will, and I think very much the kind of unconventional use of materials that you might see from the art world as a whole today. Um, and I'll just leave it to you guys to kind of want to investigate each of these artists more if you want. But I think, again, all of these artists here moving forward, that we see, especially from Mabel Poblet onward, are really these sort of millennials who travel back and forth and I think are really making art that is more in dialogue with the greater art world, and you might have to kind of struggle to relate it back to Cuba, but I do think there is a, 1 foot in Cuba, 1 foot beyond Cuba, and whether or not Cubans continue to kind of straddle both worlds is a really important question to ask, because of course this is, is this within the revolution? This is outside the revolution. This is kind of, I think, an artist wanting to address the hyper-realism, photorealism of the 1970s. Um, but of course, what we saw in the 1980s is yeah, maybe similar to what we're seeing today, a kind of interest in the international art world. But now, of course, these artists can actually engage and exhibit their work outside of Cuba. Like Alex Hernandez is someone I think whose work is on display here in Tampa at the Tampa Museum, and you can see how far and wide he's traveled. And I think his artwork addresses tourism specifically, and maybe the alienation of tourism. You can see it says his work reflects the Cuban dream of Miami, presented similarly to a movie set. So it's not kind of like we saw earlier, the Disneylandification of Cuba. The way tourism is almost like, this fairy tale of going to Miami is the same as maybe the fairy tale of dressing up like your master, the slave dressing up like her master. Here we're looking into the reflection of the pool, and the pool's reflection, I think, is intentionally kind of somewhat grotesque and drippy and not at all like doesn't at all preserve the veneer of paradise. And of course, the lawn chairs are empty, and you're high up above the city, so you're in this ivory tower, and so there it looks like at first glance a desirable place, but then as you look further and look longer, there's something kind of gruesome, if not kind of like horrifying about the absence of people, and or just the elitism of this location where you're not really at ground level with reality. You're really removed from it. And likewise here, the pool looks kind of eerie. You're looking out in this kind of wall of nature. The lawn chairs are empty. And I think the idea is like you're supposed to project yourself onto the lawn chairs, and this is a visualization of paradise, but there's something kind of off. But it's subtle enough to kind of make you sort of wonder, like, what is it about this that seems to be desirable and yet isn't? And I think that's kind of the idea here. At least that's my interpretation of his work. And you could also look at the pool as like, a metaphor for the Straits of Florida. Traveling across the water. But of course, from a tourist perspective, the pool is just, a body of water that you enjoy. So water for Cubans is, either, excluded exclusively for tourists, or a place where you throw yourself in and endanger yourself to seek freedom. Whereas for tourists, a body of water is just that, an obstacle to get to where you want to go, or a place where you enjoy your leisure time. And I think he's playing with that kind of different, playing with the metaphor, but of course also the reflection and contemplating, life in Miami, and thinking that this might be the dream that you have when you go to Miami, or at least this is the tourist dream of Cuba. And that's a way of acknowledging that Cubans have their own sort of idea of paradise, but it's very different than what a tourist sees. And of course, they come together in Cuba. And maybe even something like this. I think this is the strongest of the pieces by him, if only because you get this intimate proximity to the chair, and it becomes so much more than just a chair. Right now, it's almost like the long shadows imply like the end of the revolution, like the twilight, and the chair is this empty thing that you're supposed to lounge on, and there's no one there. And I can't help but think of this picture we saw earlier in the semester, this woman looking out, contemplating the future, right after the end of slavery, this sort of woman who's kind of untethered from her own sense of place and purpose in a world without slaves. Here you've got this kind of chair with, where you're supposed to think, oh, if I'm sitting in that chair, I'm in a place of luxury and paradise. And yet I think there's a much more than meets the eye here. The kind of, especially that long shadow implies kind of there, it's the end of the day or the dawn of a new day. So again, the strategy of using metaphor as a kind of shield behind which to address the contemporary world. And although I don't think he's afraid of commenting on the reality, but I think he's not criticizing the government so much as criticizing tourism. And that's a very clever way of maybe indirectly criticizing the government. But by pointing out the cruise ship, you're kind of criticizing the capitalist world and the idea of tourism as it served capitalism. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory here. But I think it's more than that because, of course, the Cuban government is enabling all this sort of tourism. And I'm just going to need more artists. I think this is one of the more powerful ones we'll see today. I think especially if you think about this is really getting a lot closer to being very on the nose and critical about, well, you think about like these people are all standing, looking in different directions, vulnerable, totally nude, clay figures that have all the sort of fragility and vulnerability for being made of clay and nude. And I think they're meant to really can't help but think of them as meant to represent the average Cuban contemplating. This is almost a statement against the communal nature of Cuba, right? These are all individuals. There's nothing revolutionary. They're not wearing any, they don't look like Che Guevara. There's no stars. They're kind of like universal humans, but they're kind of standing together, wondering about the future. And there's no sense of like talking to each other. They're all kind of isolated and individualized. And it's much more than that, though, of course, too, because, we're also looking at these things drooping down above, which are actually shower nozzles that are going to rain down on the figures and kind of another odd reference to Ana Mendieta covered in mud here. Um, but I think the real power here is when the water turns on, the figures decay and decompose and fall and collapse. And then you're left with this puddle of water. And what a powerful sort of performance slash installation with a kind of element of chaos and predictability. And it becomes a whole new work of art. These figures perishing maybe in as they cross the Straits of Florida. That's, I think, the metaphor here that, it's like a graveyard now. And so, really powerful work of art. I think you should definitely consider, her as an artist to write about. And I think maybe even like more, confrontational than any much that we've seen so far. And here we are in 2012. And I think you really have to consider that we're only a few years away from the death of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. I'm sorry, Hugo Chavez, who dies in 2013. Very likely under very suspicious circumstances. Some people claim, and I'm not going to say that this is an absolute fact, but a lot of people claim that he might have been assassinated using some kind of poison because he got really sick really quickly. Some people say that the United States played a role in his assassination, something to consider, but certainly his death means Cuba loses its lifeline from Venezuela. And I think that's what Alejandro Campins is talking about in 2014. He's addressing this idea that the future is uncertain. A light shining down, the decay. This for me is really the kind of grotesque, defeatist subject matter that Antonia Itis portrayed with her gruesome, the figure at the podium with the grotesque, as they said, the defeatist imagery of the Cuban people. Well, here he's almost kind of made that defeatist subject matter, like the whole point of his artwork, a banner that doesn't say anything, a kind of world that looks like it's decaying and falling apart, a light that's shining that doesn't really serve anything. And I think it's all meant to be like a metaphorical comment on the end of the Cold War, being in this intermediary space between maybe the end of the revolutionary era and the end of the Cold War. There's like a pillbox or a bunker, a relic from the Cold War. And you could see it as a, again, a metaphor for society in decline. Here we got two different kind of light fixtures illuminating an empty billboard. And of course, in Cuba, a billboard is loaded, should be a place of propaganda. But here we've got an empty billboard, and again, with almost like a watery landscape with a black backdrop. And so, the fact that he's painting such a kind of negative view of Cuban society, I think shows that there is a real shift going on. And I think that shift is really people an awareness that they're entering a new age, the end of an era. The same way Glexis Novoa's work here almost foreshadowed the end of this dependence on the Soviet Union, and addresses that through monuments and kind of giving these monuments a sense of decay, and like they're kind of obsolete the way a payphone is obsolete in New York. These monuments of Cuban Revolution become almost obsolete in a time of extreme, poverty and hunger during the special period and onward. And so here, something as simple as the last remnants of a sugar mill becomes so much more than that, right? It becomes a metaphor for, the way sugar mills, are a relic from the past, or should be a kind of something that symbolizes the over dependence on sugar. Well, likewise, maybe that becomes a metaphor for the decay and decline of the revolution, its infrastructure, and over dependence on politics, perhaps. So, much more than meets the eye. Um, and even today, Cuba continues to make sugar, but not at nowhere near the output that it had been before, and probably should just stop producing sugar. I think recently, I think even now the government, they're talking about new guidelines for sugar, and I think I heard the health secretary say there should be no sugar consumption, which is, probably there's some truth to the fact that sugar is not good for us and hasn't been good for Cuba, and yet continued to be reliant on sugar as the main export to the Soviet Union. So hopefully those sugar plantations in Cuba will become solar farms or something like that in the future, ideally. So again, it's Devil's Slide, I think, is a pillbox in, I think, California, but another relic from the Cold War. And I think it's a way to comment on just the idea of, Fidel Castro himself, or the revolution kind of being a relic from another era that has kind of lost or overstayed its welcome, or overstayed, lived longer than it should have. Fidel Castro really never relinquished. I mean, in the end, he kind of finally relinquished power, but many years after, I think he had his chance to create a system that passed power on to the next person without that person just being his brother or family member. And that's always tricky, but I think the real measurement of a revolution is its ability to transfer power to the next generation. But that's always very hard because people want to preserve the gains of the revolution. Maybe the next generation might roll back a lot of those advancements. So it's really hard to kind of you know to create a kind of some kind of foundation, and for to assume that the next generation will keep building on it. um, and I think Fidel Castro, his death in 2016 is such a upheaval in terms of the Cuba's self identity. He's so fundamental for Cuba as a kind of father figure, as a symbol of of reliability, a constant. And so Cuba, after the death of Fidel, is really a totally different world. And I think it's, again, these artists are all kind of, I think, underlying their work is a sense of kind of, well, what is the future? What is our commitment to Cuba? What's our commitment to the art world beyond Cuba? And what is the future of Cuba? And so you might look at a lot of this work as metaphorically relating to these subjects, and or just being apart from the revolution, maybe even an escape from all the anxiety that people are feeling in Cuba. And that's just something for you guys to think about. If you pick an artist, you consider all these different themes. And I think the last artist we'll look at today is one of the most important, because he really is someone who's, I think, addressing a kind of carrying off the tradition of Wilfredo Lam, with a kind of greater interest in the Afro-Cuban diaspora, or the African diaspora, which is the Africans leaving Cuba, leaving Africa, or forcibly migrated to other countries, and reflecting on sort of their place in post-colonial Caribbean or Cuba or wherever in the world. And look at how far and wide he's traveled. I mean, he's pretty much been all over the world, and you can see he's literally like violently penetrating himself with these flags. And very much, I think, a symbol of the Latin X, and making sexual challenging conventions with sexuality. Of course, I think also commenting on the history of slavery and exploitation of Africans, and slaves, and otherwise, and of course maybe the indelible stain of slavery and how it continues to kind of mark society as we globalize. You can't kind of forget that there's this history that we're still kind of, I think, unwilling to address, which is maybe, whether it's slavery, segregation, or just a sense of kind of supremacy, white supremacy, or capitalist supremacy, the way nationalism overlaps with ethnicity and racism. So I think he's, someone who's kind of in one way kind of carrying on the spirit of the Cuban Revolution, standing up to oppression, standing up to capitalism or tyranny or imperialism. I think that's partly why he's been able to travel and gain so much support from the Cuban government, even though it's somewhat more provocative. And I think he's tackling things which decades ago might have been more of a third rail, um, whether it's homosexuality or just even kind of maybe criticizing institutions. Of course, I think the question is he criticizing the Cuban institutions, or is he just kind of criticizing colonial institutions? And can you really distinguish them at this point? But I think either way, his work is super powerful because he's, putting himself, you know, in his work of art that's very bold and very courageous, and I think very powerful. He almost becomes the thing holding up the flagpole, but he's also kind of chained to the flagpole. So he's using very powerful imagery, minimalist, and it's kind of one foot in performance, one foot in politics, and absolutely not art that's for tourists. And I think that for me is the most important point, that he's not someone who's pandering to tourism. And I think he's really gone beyond Cuba and become almost like an ambassador for the art world, that benefits from the kind of the Cuban integrity as it has it stood up to the United States, but also I think showing that he's kind of got a greater commitment to perhaps his Africanness as much as his Cubanness, right? To his perhaps his sexual orientation as it relates to his sense of identity or sense of nationalism, right? And holding the flag, using the flag, is something we'll see with other artists as well. I can't help but think of Robert Mapplethorpe. His work was subject to a lot of controversy because of the nudity, male nudity. People get very uncomfortable around male nudity, and female nudity has become almost like this objectified, kind of commodified thing that you see all over society. And yet male nudity is still somewhat taboo. And of course, homosexuality and celebrating other alternative lifestyles is still, I think, can be a third rail subject for a lot of people. But I think this kind of has started shifting in the last few decades. So he's someone I certainly would recommend if you want to write about kind of the role of performance. And I think here, this for me is a wonderful place to end, because remember, Wilfredo Lam was offering this vision of restoring African dignity with his jungle, a way of, remember the Trojan horse idea, bringing his painting to the art world as a way to kind of revolutionize and kind of cause, maybe bring these issues that are been whitewashed. The gallery itself, the museum, a symbol of the ultimate symbol of whitewashed, right? And remember, the Guggenheim is where in the way the Western world goes to apologize for and atone for its sins against the rest of the world. Once you bring the jungle to the Guggenheim, on one extreme, you could say now you've appropriated and neutered the jungle. And in a way, that is what happens if you remember the excerpt from the MoMA about the meaningfulness of the jungle. But at the other extreme, you could say just by the jungle being there, you've kind of created this Trojan horse where you maybe are transforming the Western world from within the greatest of all institutions in the art world, the Guggenheim. Well, likewise, I think Carlos Martial bringing his nude body chained up, it's almost like you can't neuter it. You can't deny the shackling element of colonialization, and bringing that into the Guggenheim and making a kind of display of kind of almost slavery really has all the awkwardness that you should feel when it comes to addressing the legacy of slavery. The nude body, and of course, being stripped of all your clothing was part of slavery. So it's much more than just sort of your body being a canvas, but rather it's like a reminder of you being a beneficiary of all these centuries of slavery. Just eating sugar or eating chocolate today. You can't eat chocolate without having some kind of support for slavery, because I think every piece of chocolate in the world has some link to some form of human slavery today. So I think one part of what he's doing here is he's kind of saying, look, you aren't like slavery isn't over. It's still going on, even if it's just you benefiting from all the centuries of slavery that resulted in the world, modernizing and having all these products that were produced by slave labor. So I think it's really powerful and much more than just performance. It's like, metaphorical and an institutional critique and very bold. And, like the Cimarron, for me, is a really powerful figure from Cuban history, someone who escaped slavery only to sort of be doomed to being confined in this foreign world that's not your own homeland. And so for me, the Martial taking his body, putting in the Guggenheim is almost like the antithesis of the Cimarron, someone who's, just really now not in the wilderness. Now he's kind of taking that kind of Cimarron like quality, escaping from slavery and kind of bringing that into the Guggenheim and kind of holding up a mirror to the people there. Of course, it's still a performance, so, but I think so it's temporary and it's maybe not a permanent thing. So, you have to wonder if maybe one day he'll have to deal with the same Anna Mendieta dilemma, which is how do you make a performance, not just a photograph of a performance as the final piece, right? But one thing I also love about this is it's not for tourist consumption. This is someone who's clearly transcended the kind of pitfall of kind of, remember, not to use it, the puteria, whoring yourself off for foreign consumption, for tourist consumption. Here, I think it's totally opposite. Here, it might seem like that at first, but it's much more than that because he's really kind of reclaiming his dignity by almost, by being so vulnerable and by ironically like in shackling himself, he's kind of liberating himself, right? And I think that's something worth considering. So the guy taking the machete, which was a tool of sugar production, and now fighting off the dogs of the Cuban Guajiro, of the overlord, is a really powerful subversion of the tool of slavery and sugar production. Remember those dogs we saw before? And so likewise here, here he is on top of a horse. This is earlier, I think earlier on in his career. But you really can, I think he's got a really vibrant future ahead, with Fredo Lamb subverting sugar and restoring it or giving African culture a chance to kind of be celebrated in spite of sugar is really powerful. And so, he's a great person to write about if you want to write about someone more focused on performance. And you'll probably find a lot more recent works that I think will be very interesting as an update to, the post-pandemic world, post-Fidel world. And of course, here I think he's in Brazil. So he continues to travel the world and I think be this sort of international ambassador for the African diaspora, but also for Cuba and sort of people questioning the kind of the nature of globalization, right? And where all the races and identities fit into it. And what does it mean to be global? Is your body global? Is your mind global? And so next week we'll be looking at this question of artists in the street and this, continuing from Martel, you can say, well, this institutional critique is so fundamental to his, if it, maybe if not, even though it's not a critique, maybe if it's not a critique of Cuba, it's a critique of the United States. Hold on just a moment. A critique of the art world. So just to, as a kind of set you up for what we could be next week, we're going to be looking at this sort of institutional critique by artists who take their art to the street. And I don't think they're just critiquing the institution, but you can't help but, see this as kind of the equivalent of Banksy taking their art to the street as a way to bypass the gallery system, to bypass the museum system, and to just hold up a mirror to everyday Cubans who are dealing with things like what you see here. This is a street dog, as they're called in Guatemala, chucho. And, this is something that is so powerful and so ground level and something we haven't seen from any of the artists we saw today, the millennial artists. This is something we'll see next week. And this is exactly the kind of thing that might be, if you're an artist trained by the revolution, if you go on to paint canvases with street dogs that are emaciated to the bone, that might be an example of biting the hand that feeds you. and you might end up with you losing a lot of government support, which can happen very kind of subtly and slowly, and might slowly marginalize you. Just like, remember, Antonia Itis was pushed to basically making paper mache for children, which is, not the worst, but still a real insult to her career. So you really have to think about how these street artists are kind of an expression of this idea that there's still an maybe unspoken subject that these millennial artists aren't addressing, which is the day-to-day concerns of these Cubans, and doing so less metaphorically, although you could say this is metaphorical, but still, I think pretty clearly, commenting on the fact that there's no food, it's an empty bowl. The dog was very kind of sad and weary, but very much a metaphor for, I think, the average Cuban dealing with, foodlessness, and it's painted on a decaying cityscape. And so this is the kind of art we'll look at next week. And you really think, if you're still, looking for an artist to write about, there'll be a few that we see next week. Of course, you have a limited, you'll be able to turn in your paper right until the very end of the semester. I'm fine with that. But just remember, want to have picked an artist maybe by next week at the latest. And so we'll look at more examples of artists who are painting artwork on the streets of Havana. And I think maybe sowing the seeds for the next whatever metaphorical revolution or whatever comes next, because they're really still committing to artwork and committing to art as a vital form of expression in a time of uncertainty and foodlessness, especially after the pandemic. Yeah, I think there should be guidelines now up on Canvas for your paper, Dacia. So just let me know if they aren't. I think you'll see them under assignments. Actually, no, maybe you're, no, I think you're right. I think maybe I haven't posted, I did that for the other class. So I will post those today. So keep your eye out for that. And unless you have any questions, I will see you guys next week, and just keep your eye out for guidelines for your paper sometime today, and maybe in a few hours. And yeah, I'm excited for our next class. And I just want to say that it's really, it's as bittersweet as it is to say, because of course Cubans are really dealing with a lot of problems. I think it's been a really interesting semester, because you can really get this beautiful view of one country and this real kind of kaleidoscopic sort of art world that really reaches some kind of interesting chapter today. And I think it's just a really interesting sort of semester full of sort of history of Latin America, or just colonization in Cuba to the United States. And yeah, just such a really interesting subject. So I hope you guys feel the same way, and I hope you pick an artist who speaks to you. And just maybe one day you'll go visit that artist in Cuba, or maybe they'll come to Florida and visit you. So I will see you guys next week, and just let me know if you need any guidance or whatnot from your paper. If you need to reach me and I don't respond to your email immediately, just call me. I think my number is on the syllabus. You're welcome to just call my phone and reach me more in a more time urgent way. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week, and yeah, I'll talk to you then.